before we start the engine management and control side of things, I actually filmed the next segment and then remembered something. So before all of this, you need to be able to see what your engine's doing. So whether you go for the lowest budget, the middle budget option, I'm going for the proper top end, standalone ECU side of things, you need to see what your air-fuel ratio is. So you need to budget for a wideband air-fuel sensor. Now, there are a lot of options for this, like there is with everything. I've gone for an AEM one, it's pretty commonly used. I don't mind them too much. I'm not a massive fan of how the gauges look, but Innovate does one, a little bit more of a simpler gauge style on it. And they've actually switched to a slightly more, I suppose, reliable sensor setup on them now. You're looking at somewhere between about 150 to £200, I would say, for that kind of lower end of the spectrum. That comes with the sensor, the wiring, the gauge, and the controller, all that kind of stuff. Anyone who's not familiar with it, air-fuel ratio, there is a perfect air-fuel ratio. I can't remember the name for it. I'm probably going to look it up and stick it as a comment under my little mug in a minute. And that's what you're aiming for. You are aiming for that perfect amount of air to fuel. And that's how it does it. It just does a reading like that. It's real-time, white bands generally, if you get a decent one. It does show you it really accurately and really quickly as you're obviously driving your car. Too lean, really bad. Too rich, to a point, is okay. Most tuners and stuff will always go slightly on the rich side. It's better to have a little bit more fuel than not enough. But again, if it gets really, really rich, it's going to run like a pig and again causes more problems. So it just helps you keep an eye on it, especially for our budget setup and the middle setup. Wiring and setup, nice and simple with these, especially again, I'll go into this in more detail when we get onto the section in a second. But for the low budget one, the wiring is really easy because there's nothing for it to actually wire into. It's just setting up the sensor itself. For the middle and the top budget options, there will be a little bit of wiring with the actual controllers. But again, it's just a set case of wiring up your gauge like any other gauge you would, giving it power and earth and stuff. That runs down to the actual main O2 sensor that goes in your exhaust. Now, the kit will come with a weld-on bung. It's just like a threaded bung that you put in the exhaust. There'll be some instructions on there about having it at a certain amount of degrees tilt so it doesn't get moisture in it. It has to be a certain distance away from the turbos, doesn't get too much heat and stuff. But that's all in the instructions and stuff anyway. And like I said, if you're not wiring it into the actual standalone ECU and stuff, the wiring on it is nice and simple. But whatever choice you go with, you absolutely need one, so definitely budget it in. Now, this is actually quite a big topic. I kind of wish I had a seat, actually, but we'll deal with it for now. But let's start with the 900cc because, again, you're very limited with the choices that you've got. Now, I will say that, really, you've probably got two options here. I'm going to say standalone ECU, completely pointless. I would say, really, given the simplicity of this engine, the kind of power that you're going to get, the kind of functionality you're going to need, standalone ECU is complete overkill. So that really only gives you two options. They're kind of one and the same thing, but like a piggyback ECU. So anybody who doesn't know what a piggyback ECU, usually what that means is exactly that. It piggybacks onto the other, your other computer in your car. So your stock computer carries on doing all its normal thing. It's completely oblivious to what's going on. And then you bring in another computer to control something else. So in this case, it will be your second injector. Now, there's quite a few of these around. A lot of people use Det 3. They're about £170. I think Innovate does one. This is really a case of kind of how long's a piece of string, what kind of functionality you want, and you'd have to do a little bit of research. But I would say, a couple £100 for a piggyback ECU is probably normal. Now, what effectively all you're doing is that piggyback ECU will pick up some sort of signals and readings from your engine, usually like revs, boost pressure. It might take some inlet temps and things like that. Nothing massive. But effectively what it's doing then is it's taking that and then you're programming it to do something with that information. And in this case, it'd be turning the injector on and off. It's not too bad wiring wise. Like I said, it's not a vast amount that needs to be wiring it in. But one of my biggest pieces of advice is this, when I was saying about going with Det 3 or Innovate or something, is your biggest area here is support. Now, you can buy any ECU in the world that you want, but if there's not anybody that knows how to tune it, or at least doesn't have much experience in it in your local area, or there's not many forums or any groups or many wiring diagrams and stuff, it's only going to make your job a lot harder. Especially if you take it someone that's not familiar with that ECU, it might cost you a little bit more money while they kind of familiarise themselves with it, getting it set up and stuff like that. But it's actually a really, really good choice because it means that you can be really, really on the fueling. So you could be setting it by how much boost pressure it is, what revs it's at, and it'll be squirting that fuel in exactly as you need. But if you don't want to quite go that severe, or you haven't got that kind of money, or you don't want to go through all that mapping, or maybe you want to do it a little bit more yourself, there is a more budget option. Now, I will give you a rundown of this, but again, I'm going to be covering that on my build of the supercharger one, because this is the route I'm going to be taking to start with. As long as it pans out okay, that's the one I'll stick with. If it doesn't, then I'll go up to a piggyback ECU, but I want to try it first. Now, my man Rory O'Sullivan, who's over in Ireland, told me about this. We had a long chat about it on the phone because he ran this on his 1.1 turbo setup for a few years with no problems whatsoever. And effectively what it is almost like a dumbed down version of a piggyback ECU. And what it uses is an adjustable Hobbs switch. Now, a Hobbs switch is literally just a boost triggered switch. So it reads a certain boost based on what you set it at, and it turns something on. And in this case, it's turning on your injector. Now, that's no good if every time it reads a certain amount of boost, it just turns your injector on flat out, because it's going to burn the injector out, I'm sure, and it will just flood your engine with fuel. And so what you're doing is effectively stealing the signal from the ECU for your standard injector. So what you do is you wire it in like this. You take a feed from, I believe it's pin 18, but don't quote me on that, from your ECU, which is the one that goes to your normal injector. So obviously it's when it's pinging that to turn your injector on. And you take a feed of that off and you run it to your second injector. Now, and on the other side of that, from your live side, you run that to your Hobbs switch, and then you run a power from your Hobbs switch to your battery or to your power source. And what that effectively means, as you're driving along, your car, your ECU, is going to be sending two signals, essentially. One to your standard injector, pinging that like it normally does, and it's going to be trying to send it to your second injector, but it won't work because the Hobbs switch isn't on. But once your Hobbs switch gets to a certain boost, so whether you say once it reads 2 psi, it turns on, it then allows your second injector to be activated, essentially. So when your ECU pings your injector, it pings both of them and turns both of them on. So obviously the faster you go, the more fuel it puts through both of them. Now, this does come with a little bit of a disclaimer in that it kind of comes with some tweaking. It's a little bit kind of like tweaking like a carved car where you're changing the size of the needles to get the right amount of fuel. Because Rory did say when he first did it, I think he had like a Cosworth injector on there. So when that second one turned on, it threw so much fuel in, it completely overfueled and it wasn't drivable. But then he just downgraded to smaller injectors until eventually, between adjusting when it turned on, and how big the injector was and tweaking a few other little bits, he actually got it to run really good. He just got it to run a little bit on the rich side, which is perfectly acceptable. It actually makes it a little bit safer. And it ran like a dream. He said he absolutely hounded on that car for about 4 years, and I think the setup is still actually running. Now, again, I would love to show you how to do it, but obviously we haven't got time to do it now, and I'm not actually doing that conversion yet. But if you're interested in that, definitely keep an eye out for the build series, because I'm going to take you through all the bits you need. But the good thing about it is I reckon you could probably do that setup for probably 50 to 70 pounds. There are a few little bits you need to do. You need to trick the ECU a little bit, because there is actually a sensor on this that tells you how much pressure is in the system. So if it starts reading boost pressure, it cuts it off, etc, etc, etc. But definitely don't rule that out as a budget option, and we'll touch on it a lot more in a future date. Now on to the 1.1 and the 1.2. Now, really, it's probably been more accurate for me to say single point injection and multi-point injection now, rather than the 1.1 and 1.2, because it's irrelevant really to the engine size. It is just down to the amount of injectors is what your engine management solution is. Now, same with the 900cc for the single point injection in whatever size engine. It all still the same. The Hobbs switch idea is perfectly plausible. Again, you've got that sort of setup stuff, and as I mentioned about the wideband early on in the video, if you've got that, obviously then you've got your kind of monitoring and stuff like that. So that's all the same. Piggyback ECU, that's all the same. I would probably still say that standalone ECU is probably still a little bit of a waste of time on a 2-injector setup. Really, I just feel like maybe for the budget and the advantages you're going to go for, if you're going to spend all that money on a standalone ECU, you'd be better off switching up to a multi-point injection setup. Which leads me on nicely to the multi-point injection side. Again, I would say the difference here is that with the Hobbs switch, there's no point on a multi-point injection, because obviously you're not adding any more injectors. You've already got 4. The main thing here is controlling those bigger injectors if you upgrade them to actually do something else rather than like the standard fueling. I would probably even go as far as to say, like I've known of people do piggyback ECUs for the multi-points. I just kind of feel like when you get to the multi-point injection side of the 8 valves, with all the things I said about lowering compression, how much more boost and stuff you can run through them, and the potential for more power, for me at least, I would probably hop and skip over the piggyback ECU idea, just because with that, there is more effort and there is more money involved, but I feel like the advantage over the single point injection is far outweigh the extra effort. I think the amount more power and drivability and stuff you can get out of it. The standalone ECUs in themselves is a massive topic, but I'm hoping I'll be able to give you at least enough information to kind of considering as part of your tick list of whether you want to go down this route, and if you do, what sort of things you should think about. Right, now any of you who've seen any of my build series and stuff before will already know some of this stuff, but I'm running a MicroSquirrel standalone ECU system on my car. And the reason I've done that, one of the reasons I mentioned before for the piggyback ECUs, is support. Now, the support network for the MicroSquirrel, MegaSquirrel community is massive. They use these on all sorts of cars, kit cars. They've got plug and play setups for like MX-5 turbos. There's forums, there's groups. You can get loads of apps for like the Bluetooth connectivity and stuff like that. Like, it is massive, and I can't say enough how important that is. So me getting wiring diagrams, when I ran into problems, there was plenty of people that I could speak to. There's a lot of compatibility with things like knock sensor detection and stuff like that. So that's the one I went for. And I would say the same for you as well. Like, make sure that you've got the support in place, because if you go for an ECU and hardly any rolling roads can actually have got experience of it, then you have to allow a little bit of extra expense while they get used to it, etc., etc. So it's very similar to what I said about the standalone side. Now, cost-wise, yes, there is probably a lot more expense or a lot more options as well when it comes to standalone ECUs to what there is for a piggyback. Now, I paid £350 for this one. There are some additional expenses that I'll go into in a minute. I don't think that's actually that bad for the functionality you get from the MicroSquirt system. There's obviously are differences between this and the MegaSquirt. The MegaSquirt's got a lot more functions, but for this quite a simplistic engine, you don't need a lot of it. And I would say that for what, at least my needs, this is more than enough. Wiring wise, obviously when you buy the ECUs as well, this one especially came with a free loom as part of it, which I will touch on in a minute because I've got some advice regarding that. But you do have a lot of options in this space, which I'll be honest with you is kind of a blessing and a curse if I'm honest. I believe Det3 you can use as a standalone ECU as well. You can start getting into the higher price ranges as well, like Emerald ECUs are really well supported. They do get some really nice functionality with them as well, but you're talking like $650 all the way up to like the crazy prices where you get to like Haltech ECUs, which are like over £2,000. But I would argue on like a simplistic engine like this, you just don't need that kind of functionality. I think even if you've got a big budget, you could very much just look at these lower end of the price bracket ECUs, and they'll be more than enough. And there is a big advantage, even though yes, it is daunting when it comes to wiring these up. I was massively daunted by it when I first started. If you start going into this more do-it-yourself kind of vibe, so I was tempted to pay someone to do it, but my mate Al and Claudio helped me actually with the wiring and stuff. Well, right, if you do this yourself, the knowledge that you will pick up then about what all your wiring is, where it all runs, what those relays are for, what all the junction boxes do, you start to get into like the actual tuning software, not the tuning, but at least knowing your way around the table. So if you get any problems, you'll be able to work out whether it's a wiring problem, or you can check some of the tables and stuff, or your logs, or whatever you need. And you'll have some sort of vague idea whether you're going to need professional help or whether it's just burnt a relay out or something like that. And it definitely did. I know more now than I've ever done. And obviously now I've done MicroSquirt. If anyone else goes down this route, I'm more than happy to share the stuff I know, not my mapping necessarily, because obviously that cost me a lot of money. But with the actual knowledge that I've got, you'd be surprised how many people will know the answers to the problems that you come up against. Now, when it came to the wiring, effectively on paper, the wiring is easy. In that, the loom that you get with your ECU, so again, my one came with a 3-foot loom that came with it. So 3 foot's obviously not very long, but the wires are all clearly labelled. One's throttle position, one's inlet temp, one's map sensor, you know, blah, blah, etc., etc. So effectively what you're doing is go around your engine. Again, if you've got a single point injection, you can have the loom laid out in front of you. Although when it comes to actually working out what each sensor is, it is a little bit easy to label them all up less in your car, because you can see what it's actually plugging into before you take it out. And obviously if you're a multi-point injection, you can't take it out, so you have to do it inside the car anyway. I went for the slightly jankier option, where I actually cut the wiring from the original loom as long as I could, and then soldered that onto the ECU wiring, meaning obviously I didn't have to repin or worry about getting new connectors and stuff like that. Now, I will say that I've got, well, this is where my biggest piece of advice is, where I said about not cutting corners, is the triggerwheels.com, which is where I got my ECU from and my wiring, offered a option of, I think it was about £70, and I could get an 8-foot loom. Sometimes you get 8, 10 foot, stuff like that. 8 foot is really long, as you can probably guess. I could probably run it all the way to the back of the car and a bit backwards again. But I wish I'd done that, and I wish I'd done the wiring a little bit better. I mean, yes, even Al said at the start, it was just a good idea to get it all set up, get it all wired in, make sure everything works, figure out how many relays we were going to need, if we needed to chop any wires about, rather than going really, really neat and tidy and perfect to start with, and then needing to change a load of stuff because it didn't work. But I still wish I'd not cut corners at the beginning and tried to skimp a little bit on that wiring loom and just got the longer one. And the reason for that is, one, obviously it will look a lot nicer. So wherever it is you put your ECU, you know you're going to have enough wires to be able to run them all nice and out of the way, all in the same direction, up to whatever your wiring loom, up to wherever any of your sensors and stuff are. The other thing as well, like I said, I've got so many wires now that kind of go the route they have to go. I haven't got much of a choice. I've got some that's sort of cutting across, some things are about to loop around stuff I didn't really want. It's just a bit messy and a bit horrible. So I would definitely not skimp on that if you can get away with it. And also forward plan it. Forward plan. I never thought I would ever have to forward plan where wires are going to go. But you know, there were times when I've ran wires and then after I was like, oh, if I just would have ran that a bit nicer, I could have moved my gauge somewhere a bit better, but it's a bit short now. So just think about it. Think about where do you want your gauges, where's the ECU going, sort of place things around the car and then roughly figure out how long you want some of your wires to be and just judge it by that. Don't do what I did and just, you know, say, oh, I'm going to stick the ECU there because that makes sense, and then just go from there, because it definitely didn't work out as well as I liked, and I'm now having to redo it, albeit with a lot more knowledge than I had before. Now, as far as anything else that you should probably know or anything else to consider, not really. I mean, this is really where I suppose I'm trying to make sure that you do some research for yourself. Now, there's a lot of tuning software linked to each one of the ECUs. So again, you have to try and decide which one of them you want to go for. For the MicroSquirrel, I've used Tuner Studio because it's just the one that most people tend to use. There is an expense if you want the full version, and the full version does come with some stuff you're likely to need, especially around sort of like the login and a few other functions and stuff like that. It's not a vast amount of money. I think it's about $40 or something like that, the Tuner Studio one. And then obviously mapping. Mapping, again, anyone who's watched my channel will know, doesn't always go to plan. Now, I've done best laid plans. I've done everything I possibly can to test it at home, getting up to temperature. I actually managed to get it running from home with a little bit of help from, well, a lot of help from Al and Claudia and stuff. Managed to get it ticking over at least enough that I know the engine worked. It wasn't making any terrible noises, although the first time we did it, it was, and we had to rebuild it. And then I got to the rolling road and I had a fuel flow problem. Now, there's nothing I could have done to, you know, account for that. In the end, it turned out to be a massively clogged fuel filter because there was some terrible stuff going on with my fuel lines, which I've now replaced and taken that away. But that's not until after the second time I went, after fixing it the first time, and again, started tuning it, started getting it all sorted out, had a fuel flow problem, had an oil leak from my turbo oil feed, and again, I had to go home and fix it. Now, each one of those, thankfully, the first one cost me nearly £400, I think, with transport and the cost of the rolling road. The second one, nowhere near that much, because Chris from HAD is a top lad, and he didn't really charge me a lot for doing the mapping for that day. He was doing it as a bit of a favour, but it's still the transport costs. I mean, for me at least, it was like £150 to get it transported there and back. So you need to allow for that. So either you're very lucky and you live near someone, and you haven't got very much travelling to do, you've got your own trailer, you know somebody who can trailer it for you, or you have to either go into it thinking this might not go to plan and you need the money to back yourself up. Don't do what I did and kind of just assume that once you get there, assume it doesn't blow up because the mapping goes badly, that everything will just work. So I would say when it comes to getting to near the mapping, just try and make sure that you've got a little bit of money sat behind you all the time. If it doesn't go well, you can bring it home, fix it, and then save up to go get it mapped. I'd signed myself up for a few things, which I've still got coming, which are really exciting, but I've had to put back a couple of times now because I've been relying on my mapping session going to plan, and it hasn't, and I've had to let people down, and I've had to rejig things and, you know, try and get a bit of money back together to do it. So definitely don't believe that mapping is going to go to plan. But no, definitely, it is really exciting. It's really interesting getting into it. It's absolutely worth knowing and understanding the mapping for your car, especially if, like me, you want to kind of push it a bit, go to track days and do all kinds of different events. I want to be able to take my laptop with me, do a few tweaks on the fly, you know, in the winter or whatever, like, you know, tweaking mapping and stuff like that, doing data logging to find problems. If you start from this point, you do it right, you wire your car properly, you plan, you pick an ECU that's got the functionality you need, and you get the support network around you and a good mapper, then you're set. And I'll guarantee you will make some good power out of these cars. They will be reliable, regardless of what everyone says about Fiats. They are really, really solid and reliable engines, and you'll have a massive amount of fun. I've thought about giving up a few times. My only advice to you would be try not to. There's a lot of these projects that start, people get to a point and realise they've bitten off a bit more than they can probably chew. But I'm hoping that's what this video series is going to help you with. It's going to help you realise, actually, it's not all sunshine and roses, but you do have a lot of options and you just need to plan it and figure out what you're doing. Now, all of that said, the point we've got to now, you know what engine options you've got. You've potentially picked which engine option you want. You know how to lower the compression on it if you do or don't need to do that. You know about upgrading the fueling with the pumps and the regulators and the injectors. You now know what options you've got as far as ECU mapping and a few little nuggets of information. I'm more than happy to do a proper episode on my ECU setup and everything around that. I did do one right at the beginning of the channel, but I wasn't massively happy with it. I know a lot more now. So next is all of the other stuff that goes with it. Now, that's obviously a bit of a vague comment, but this is everything when it comes to like the turbo manifolds, actually getting it to fit. There are quite a few things on the 8-valve setup that you need to consider because they will need modifying. Things like oil filter location, coolant lines, a few little bits like that. And I will touch on any of the other little things that I know, like little weaknesses, like engine mounts, little modifications I think you should definitely consider if you're going to be doing it. But it's kind of the rounding off one. And if there's anything else I realise I've missed, or I think that you should know, or anyone points out that they want an answer to, I'll kind of cram it all into this last one. But it's kind of like the money maker episode, and the one I hope will just give you the last bits that you want. But definitely comment if there's anything specific you think I've missed. Obviously tell me if you think there's anything I've got wrong, and I'll look into it, make sure that I haven't got my information wrong. But definitely obviously subscribe if you want to be notified when the next one comes out. But thanks a lot for watching. I genuinely hope that you're finding it useful or entertaining, or both. And I will see you next time.